We begin now with a closer look specifically at EU energy policy. And this is to be chaired by Dame Anne Dowling. She is a professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Cambridge, where she is also deputy vice chancellor, and she is president of the Royal Academy of Engineering in the UK. Dame Anne, would you care to begin? Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome back after the tea break. Yes, in this session we're going to be analysing the EU 2030 framework for climate and energy. And I would like to start by introducing the panel. So starting on my far right, we have Didier Houssin, who is Director of Sustainable Energy Policy and Technology at the International Energy Agency. And he has worked both in industry and in the French public sector, including 7 years as Director of Energy and Mineral Resources in the French Ministry of Economy and Finances. Next to me, I have Bo Normark, who is co-chair of the Energy Platform of the European Council of Academies of Applied Sciences, Technologies and Engineering, EuroCASE. And he's also vice chairman of the National Council for Smart Grids in Sweden. On my left, I have Bertrand van Eede, who is CEO of the Climate KIC, a European public-private partnership formed to accelerate innovation in climate technologies. He's also president of the Netherlands Academy of Technology and Innovation. So we have heard already today, welcome to the EU 20 framework. At least it sets out targets for a further reduction of domestic greenhouse gas emissions, and the target is that they be at least 40% below the 1990 level. So we're here spanning the roadmaps of the 2020 and the 2050, something which there is a commitment, a binding commitment to in the 2030 framework. Ones without yet binding commitments are a 27% of energy to be generated by renewables, an improvement of energy efficiency of 27% as well, changes in the emissions trading system, and also a target level of interconnection between countries. But I think we need to view the 2030 framework in terms of wider targets of not only a green energy, but also one that is cost-effective, that enables competitiveness in the EU, and is secure. Without managing that three-way balance, we won't have jobs for our people or the money to fund the services that we all want. I'd like to just open then by asking the panel to give immediate reflections on the 2030 framework. Pluses and minuses, and then we'll take it from there. So please keep your comments fairly brief at this stage, because we'll expand on them later. And we'll start with you, please, Didier.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Briefly, the plus is first that this agreement took place and was reached. I think there is a political significance which is important, and with the recent news of an agreement between China or a commitment of the US and China also to move forward, that goes also in the direction of a potential agreement next year, which is per se a positive signal. Will it be, I mean, looking at the targets that the EU has set itself, I think the most important one, the 40% greenhouse gas abatement target, is in line with our 2DS scenario modeling in the IEA, so it's going in the right direction. It's certainly the central objective, and what we would see as also positive is that it's not really trying to pick winners, but providing a global objectives, leaving some flexibility to member countries how they will reach it. Having said that, it remains to be proven how it's going to be reached and what policy tools will be put in place. It's particularly true for energy efficiency, where probably 27% is not that high, and maybe the EU could go further, but there is a commitment to review that target. But the key point is first how the 2020 objective will be met, and which political tool will be put in place. And for the renewable targets, there is no targets at national level, which means that some monitoring will be necessary at EU level to make sure that it will be reached. I think the last point which I think needs to be highlighted is that there would be a need to complement this objective with a stronger innovation policy to make sure that they can be achieved, and innovation has a strong role to play in that change. But we can come back to that later.
Okay, thank you. Bo.
First of all, of course, I agree with what was already said here. I think it's important to stress when I read this that I'm lacking some consistency here, because on one hand we say that all evidence shows that collaboration is a key to make things cheaper overall. I mean, we should cooperate between the countries in Europe. At the same time, we have now targets here that are individual for the countries, and I don't see the strong incentive for cooperation actually. And one reflection I have here is, I mean, this target on interconnection capacity, 10% to be increased to 15%. I mean, I think interconnection, that is a way to demonstrate how you should cooperate or foster cooperation. First of all, I think 10% flat interconnection target and a 15 is completely wrong, because it varies so much between the countries. Countries with higher degree of variable production will need much, much higher, and others will need less. So I think it's one of the key elements for pushing cooperation is not there in my view. I mean, I come from the Nordic country. We have already 30% interconnection capacity. So should we stop developing? Or so I'm critical there. But at the same time, of course, I'm happy that it's we have the targets online. But I think to make another comment, I think on the we can come back to the ETS, I guess.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So what would you think was a better figure for the interconnection?
I think interconnection, we should have a little more intelligent. It should be based on renewable, variable renewable in the various countries. It should be different. I mean, we should be bold enough to have at least when we judge new projects, we need to have a more sophisticated tool than just a flat rate.
So you would be looking for some formulaic thing, but based on the energy mix in countries. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much,
Bertrand.
All right, so first of all, it's good that we have something in writing where the states, the leaders in Europe agree, the 40, the 27 and the 27. At the same time, we know if we listen to the scientists, and we need to take the scientists very seriously, we know it's not enough. So we have to get going at least at what we have in implementation. And I believe it's very important that we translate this policy to the citizens, and then especially focus on cities and regions. We need to basically, if you look at in Europe, there's 300 billion euros available for regions, of which 20% has to be spent in this area. So to me, a key focus for Climate Kick is taking the policy and getting it in concrete action on the ground, so people in various pieces of parts of Europe can see the value that we're bringing and how they can translate this policy in personal action as well. So that would be my big theme.
Okay, so almost there's the two ends of the spectrum really between Bo and Bertrand, because Bo, you're saying let's have more interconnections even between countries, and you're saying let's do it at a city level and get the citizens to have ownership perhaps of their own energy.
It's not necessarily inclusive. I think all these things that need to happen behind the scenes needs to happen as well. But there is just a big urge that we start showing collectively value, reinforce the value that the European Union has. There's some elections coming up in the UK not too far from now. So it's very important that we start communicating in simple terms with our own citizens. And I think regions and cities is a great way to do it. And then, of course, you need to do all those other things and connecting the grids and so on. But to me, that would be key priority.
Thank you. But of course, one thing that citizens notice is cost.
Yeah.
Do you want to comment on the cost of energy?
Again, this is an area where there needs to be a good level of communication. There is a lot we can do in terms of energy savings. Cost doesn't necessarily always have to be a negative. It may sound strange, but probably the biggest impact that we can have is around the 20% savings, because every unit of savings means about 3 units of production. So to me, getting the citizens rallied around the savings and also giving them means, and maybe that's also something to think about, how you can give the citizen more means to start saving. You know, if you look at the housing in Europe, most of it has been built after the Second World War, more or less. It's there's a big opportunity for us to do something about it. And then, you know, that the cost of energy is maybe a bit high, but that's, you know, you can reduce that cost by, again, going back to the good old energy saving measures.
Okay. So cost as a driver to reduce energy. Is it as simple as that, Bo?
Well, I agree, but I think also one thing that is probably not addressed sufficiently here, because I agree with that, apart from the interconnection, there is a lot of things we can do on consumer level. I think it's underestimated the power that we have if we are shifting investments from utilities to consumers, because they will react much faster. And if you look at what is happening now in Europe, the utilities used to be filthy rich. They are not so rich anymore, and they don't have the money to invest as they used to have. At the same time, you can see that a lot of the interesting technologies that we are talking about, they are probably more suited for investment made by consumers. And that's something I think we have. We always describe this power sector as being slow and nothing happened, and very, very long investment times. That is not correct anymore. I mean, if you consumer invest in PV solar, they don't invest for 60 years. They have a much shorter payback. If you invest in wind, it's not 40 years, it's 20 years. So we see shorter investment terms, different investors, and that, I think, make the plan more likely to happen, in fact.
So domestic investors can decide on a very short time to make a change.
Absolutely, and
Yeah.
we have seen it already.
Yeah, okay. Diddler, do you want to come in here?
Yes, I think this what we're seeing and to see about the weakness, some of the weaknesses of the European policy is particularly visible on the power markets, where we have increasing retail prices in large part due to the support to renewables, and at the same time a decline in wholesale prices, which means that there are limited incentives to invest in backup power generation. So which raises the issue of now security of supply for power, and more discussion taking place in different member states about capacity markets. And this presents a risk of further splitting policies at national level. So there is and one of the key objectives should be to strengthen the internal market and having more interconnection, as was said before. But one of the limits, of course, of the EU policy is that you have different visions about the energy mix, and the consequences of decision being made in one country are very important for the neighboring countries, and the lack of global vision for the future of the power mix is probably one of the obstacles that need to be
How would you address
at EU level. Probably through having a more coordination at EU level and a global vision about the security of power security of supply, as was discussed in previous sessions,
But it is-
integrating a large chunk of renewables raised a number of issues.
But it is rather difficult to have such a global EU-wide view when there are countries with such different views on nuclear, for example. So how would you see it working?
I think one of the issues today is the question of capacity markets and should be dealt with a certain coordination at EU level to avoid that there are decisions made at national level that may have negative impacts for the EU market per se.
And could that just be done with pricing, or do there need to be bigger incentives than a realistic carbon price?
I'm not going to come up with a broad plan, but just wanted to highlight some of the weaknesses of the EU policy, as you started by asking, what about costs? Mm-hmm. There is certainly an evolution in electricity prices that is not very favorable for consumers. They're not very popular for consumers. I think this needs to be tackled in a global manner, as well as the question of security of supply.
I mean, cost, of course, isn't simply for domestic consumers. It's also also has a big impact on the really energy-intensive industries, particularly materials. There's a great danger that we offshore the processing of aluminium, steels, and so on. Does anyone want to comment on that?
Yeah, this is a very good point. One of the points the IEA has highlighted in recent work is the problem of the high cost of energy supply in Europe, compared in particular with the States and with the United States, and it's linked to, of course, to the shale gas revolution. But also, electricity prices are much lower in the US than in Europe, and this has, of course, a number of consequences for energy-intensive industries and for its competitiveness, and it's an important point to bear in mind.
So I felt that it was something that's very much missing in the 2030 framework, where really the sort of almost throwaway comment of hope towards the energy-intensive industries seemed to be that CCS might come along and be their salvation, at least in terms of carbon. Do we think CCS is viable in that on that kind of horizon?
I think it's two issues. One is viability, and the other one is cost again.
Yeah.
Because I mean, as far as I've seen, is that I mean, costs are quite high, even if we get around the problem of deposition, or it's still very expensive.
Yeah. Okay. Should we perhaps move on to the ETS? Bo, do you want to? Do you think the ETS, as laid, the changes in the ETS as laid out in the 2030 framework are workable? Are they going to enable us to re-establish credibility in terms of emission trading?
Well, let me say I'm doubtful, because I think that the ETS system, I mean, it has been debated whether this was success or failure. I mean, it delivered the result, but in a different way. So I think the ETS system, I mean, clearly, but this is a personal opinion. I mean, of course, a carbon tax would be much more efficient. And one way to achieve something in that direction is, of course, have a floor in the trading system. I think that is inevitably we need that.
So that there is some security, some
yes.
Confidence given in investors.
Yeah. I think that's inevitable.
Yeah, on this debate about the carbon tax versus an ETS system, the IEA is quite neutral. What is important is really that the system works and puts a penalty into carbon emissions. And so far, there's been some disappointment in the ETS system in Europe. And from that perspective, I think the recent agreement really sets the objective to strengthening the ETS market through creating a reserve and through increasing step by step the reduction factor, even if it's planned in a reasonable way, because at the same time we need to look into the economic consequences. And we need to bear in mind that the fact that CO2 prices are so low in Europe, carbon prices are so low in Europe, it's a consequence of the economic situation and very low growth over the last years. It's not because the system per se was dysfunctional. So I think the statement that the ETS system need to be maintained and strengthened to provide a real price signal looking forward in terms of decarbonization of the power system and the industry is a sound decision from the EU. The question is how will it be implemented?
And are the changes being suggested sufficient to have an impact? Do you have a view on that?
I think it's got to be a question of implementation. It's probably a progressive way, which is understandable if you look at the economic situation of Europe, and we will need more economic growth to speed up the process in terms of strengthening the ETS market.
Mm-hmm. But maybe economic growth then comes back to wanting available power at cost, at a reasonable cost. I mean, this is part of the same circle, isn't it? Can I just ask about what we might see as being things that might make a difference to energy security? I know the IEA's predictions, which were quoted in the 2030 framework, were EU countries' reliance on imported oil going from 80% today up to 90% by 2035, and imported gas reliance going from 60 to more than 80%. Should we be, well, I think we should be concerned about that, particularly when you see which countries we're importing from and maybe the risk that proposes. Do you have any solutions to suggest there?
I might not have a full solution, but at least an idea, and that is something that I think is an underestimated opportunity, and that is electrification of the heat sector with heat pumps. Okay. Because there has been, it's one of the technology changes that has not been observed, that heat pumps has become dramatically better. I mean, today we have an annual heat factor of 5 and better for the heat pump, which means that you can produce heat with a very low amount of electricity. And heat pumps go very well together with wind power, in fact, because they can also take care of some of the variabilities, because you can store heat in water, which is very cheap. Mm-hmm. So I think
so
it's
it with a local storage.
It's underestimated, and in Sweden actually 50% of the single-family homes today have heat pumps, mm-hmm. And the result is pronounced, I would say, on the efficiency.
That would have an impact on your domestic buildings and efficiencies.
No, I would say that the energy security is a big opportunity for Europe, mm-hmm. in its nation states, to show its added value.
Right.
To have a more of a trusting environment back and forth, because that's what we need. And at the same time, you see citizens are not going to wait. They're going to put solar powers on the roof. They're going to look at heat pumps, and I think that's so. To me, the external threat, which is very real, is a very big opportunity for Europe to do something about its own sustainability.
But again, you really see the response to that happening almost at an individual domestic level, rather than through communities or utilities.
You see people individually. You see neighborhoods mm-hmm. starting to do things. There's this little villages, if you will. People are getting together, and so there is an undercurrent that's very real, okay. And I think it's very positive.
Adela?
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the points we'd like to make at the idea is that the transition to a low carbon economy is also good for energy security. There is in general no contradiction. I mean, there are some exceptions, in particular for coal, because if you have strong coal resources, that you have a contradiction between energy security and climate change policy. But in general, it's not the case, and both go in the same direction. I think it's very clear in the targets that the EU had set itself, because renewables, of course, is a domestic resource with low operational cost. And if you see that today the renewable market is moving more and more towards the emerging economies, in particular China, which is the first market. And I think that one of the key driver for developing renewables is energy security, because it's a way to diversify from imported resources. It's also industrial policy in the case of China. But so renewables go also in the direction of energy security and also energy efficiency. If you think about the fact that a very large chunk of the gas demand in Europe is for the residential sector or the power sector. If your system is more efficient, you will need more imported gas, and this is quite significant. So energy efficiency at the end of the day is good both for climate change, for energy security, and for competitiveness, especially for regions like the EU that have very limited endowments in terms of the domestic resources. Of course, the last point would be to develop domestic resources when it comes for the gas issue, because I think that's where the geopolitical risks are the highest today. Energy efficiency is one thing. Increasing the internal market, the interconnections, and more solidarity between member countries, because not all of them are as dependent on imports, but also developing domestic production, and that comes back to the discussion on shale gas. And I fully agree with previous comments that anyway the future for shale gas in Europe is not going to be very bright. It could be a small contribution to the gas supply in Europe, but not at the end of the day, the EU will remain massively dependent on imports.
Okay, thank you. I think at this stage I'll open it to the floor. Yes.
Yeah, well, one question. Robert Sokolow, Princeton University. One question for the design of this 2030 project is how exclusively to be inward-looking? And the same question is coming up as the U.S. confronts similar issues of plans in essentially the same time frame. There's a process underway called the Quadrennial Technology Review at the Department of Energy. I'm part of that, and it will have the same opening question. Do we look exclusively how to make the U.S. more competitive and prices lower there? Or shall we, and cleaner technology there, or shall we actually consider ourselves world players with a very large part of the energy decision-making going on in the developing world that has impact on us through the global environmental issues? And if you take that second objective seriously, you would presumably set aside, maybe let's say a number, 25% of your total effort, be effort that looked outward, that would look at city development and leapfrogging around building design and appliance design and transport that had very little application in Europe, but would be directed at the developing world. Is that on the agenda? I mean, I am struck in both that basically we still don't see ourselves as part of a globe. We see ourselves in a competitive mode with other regions that are like ourselves, which is an indulgence at this point.
Well, I think it's a good question. I suppose we've been taking on this particular panel a European view because we were asked to discuss the 2030 European framework. But I think it is an excellent question. And maybe it's how do we link in with the rest of the world? Are we developing our low carbon technologies and ways of working in cities that have global influence, for example, Bertram?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And this brings together the need for other fora. You know, you get for example, the COP21 coming up next year, where everybody gets together. But for example, you see increasingly people living in slums. And there's people that more or less stay in those slums their whole life. So what is it that we can do with particular solutions? And I think if you, going back to cities and regions and some of the poorer regions, the solutions you can have over there, it's happening in Europe, are applicable outside Europe as well. So I would look at real concrete practical solutions, but then you need to look at the programs that most countries have. You get your USAID, all European countries have a foreign aid kind of thing. World Bank is active in this area, and that's where you need to bring those people together. But to me, it's a little bit topic that's outside the energy policy in itself, but it is important.
And do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think the point is quite valid, and I think that the IEA in all our work, we take anyway a global perspective. So I mean, sometimes it's not very easy to comment on EU policy because our perspective is more global. And when you're addressing the energy transition and the issue of climate change is of course a global issue. Yeah. And if in all our long-term forecasts we really highlight the fact that the increase in energy demand will be entirely in emerging economies and developing economies. So you're perfectly right. That's where the issue of international cooperation is important. In our own technology network in the IEA, we have more and more participation of non-OECD countries. China is one of the most important contributor to our technology networks, just to give you an example. And in terms of the next issue that we are going to address in our study energy technology perspective, the first one next year will be about innovation and the role of innovation in climate policy, which is a global issue, and including the technology transfers and how to enhance international cooperation. And in 2 years' time, I will address the question of large cities through urban energy, because you're perfectly right to highlight that if you think that the 70% of the world population is going to live in large cities, the way they will be organized in the future in terms of transport, in terms of district heating, in terms of urban planning will be key for the energy issue.
Thank you. Paul?
I think we have to realize that the time when we were developing things that were then transferred to other countries and area is diminishing, because, I mean, we talk about that we might have a situation where people are disconnecting from the grid. We are talking about 1.6 billion people that are not connected to anything. And I can see a development where you will develop in a different way. I mean, they will not copy us. I hope they won't. And that means that we are in Europe less likely, in fact, to lead the way here. It's same thing with cities. I mean, we can think about how many cities we are building in Europe, new cities. Mm-hmm. Not many, and we have a different problem to solve. So it's increasingly, I would say, less likely that we will develop these technologies that will be used in other parts of the world.
Yes.
I'd like to follow up on Rob's question. I'm not sure you answered it the way I understood it. I wonder if the question was maybe in the United States we use the RFS to meet certain goals in terms of renewable fuels, and one of the ways of satisfying that is that we can import Brazilian cane sugar. Ethanol is considered qualified under the RFS as advanced biofuel, and I wonder to what extent your policy incorporates a similar concept, because Brazil is poised to expand very dramatically in its ability to produce during the next 25 years.
Okay. Does anyone want to comment on that?
Yeah, to my knowledge, the case in terms of the biofuels obligation, that you can import biofuels from a lot of you can meet the targets in terms of biofuel incorporation through imports. I don't think, I'm not an expert of EU policy, but I think it's the case also in Europe. Having said that, there are also limitations in the US in terms of in terms of export of oil and gas, etc.
So yes, it's one way of meeting targets, but actually I think this was trying to address really producing some global change. Yes, question there?
My name is Michel Rentena. I'm the Dutch climate ambassador, so responsible for climate negotiations and also the 2030 energy package. I want to follow up on the same subject. Obviously, I'm very familiar with the critique on the 2030 package and everything, but I would also like to ask your opinion on in what way can it serve as an example as well. We're the third block, let's say, in the world of emitters, if you count the US and China. But also within Europe, we basically have a picture of the entire world. The same debates that we have within Europe between Western Europe, Eastern Europe about the cost of climate change versus the cost of jobs, etc. The same discussions are going on in the global discussions, basically the foundations of how we're going to get an agreement in Paris next year. Given the fact that, in fact, our percentages in Europe are more ambitious than anybody else in the world, can we not use this 2030 package A as to lead and B as an example of how we found somehow a compromise, and I'm very familiar with what it took to get to that compromise, to get a compromise between indeed those two conflicting stories where climate change is absolutely necessary, but we do want to retain jobs.
Yep. Okay. Who wants to go first? Shall we start with you, Delia?
Yeah, I think it's more a comment than a question, and I fully agree. I started, that was my first point. I think the fact that this agreement was reached was a very positive signal, in particular the preparation of the negotiation in Paris next year. And had the EU failed to reach an agreement, it would have been a very negative signal. And it's true to see, it's true that the targets are fairly ambitious, and the fact that the US and of course there are a lot of question marks in terms of implementation, but I think it's very positive for the global momentum.
Well, one comment would be, because if we look at, we can be very pessimistic in Europe, but we are at least world class in efficiency. So I think efficiency target is, because long term, the most efficient one will win. So I think the efficiency target is very, very good, and probably should be tougher.
Do you want to
No, again, I think it's a very good comment, and it shows that Europe in its diversity is. We have been able to come to an agreement, which is, I think, an excellent example going into COP21 that agreements can be made. So that I think it's a very, very important signal. Yeah, agree.
Okay. There's a question at the back.
Thank you. Charles Soto, Alstom. I think we're all delighted with the progress that's been made on the 2030 framework, so it's a great discussion and a great topic. I want to come a bit back to cost, as was just mentioned. In Alstom, we recognize the importance of a portfolio of technologies if we're going to achieve the lowest cost for the future. And in the debate earlier, we talked about the cost of CCS and we talked about the price of the ETS. Myself, I was dissatisfied with the sequence with which those two topics were discussed. We discussed the CCS cost and said it was too high, and then we were sorry that the ETS price is close to zero. I would like to point out that the ETS price is intended to incentivize low-cost, low-carbon technologies.
Yeah. Yeah.
And whatever the price of CCS or other low-carbon technologies, if the price of the ETS is close to zero, you won't incentivize them. Yeah. So the point that I would like to make is I take issue with the statement that seemed to be accepted by the panel that CCS is costly. The work that we've done suggests that if you wish to achieve the greater than 40% CO2 emissions reduction or the greater than 80% CO2 emissions reduction in the medium and long term, you need a mixture of technologies. You need as much renewables as you can, and you need to back that up with other generation technologies as well as storage technologies, efficiency improvements, and so on, to get the lowest cost solution. And our modeling suggests that if you do not include CCS in the energy mix in 2050, but you do achieve the 80% emissions reduction, you'll have a significantly higher cost, between 20 and 50% higher cost of electricity if you do not use CCS. So I would like to come back to the comment earlier that CCS is costly and say, I don't think that's the case. And I believe that the IEA and the IPCC have said similar things. But I wouldn't want to leave the statement that CCS is expensive unchallenged. But of course, as part of a portfolio of technologies, including renewables wherever we can.
You want to comment?
Yeah, I just want to say that I fully agree with what you've just said, and I didn't react before on the question of CCS because we moved to another subject, but it's true. Immediately, CCS is too expensive, and as CCS doesn't produce energy, I mean, it's really a way to address the carbon problem. If you don't have economic incentives, there won't be spontaneously investment. So that's and the IEA has publicly said that we regretted that there is not enough progress in terms of CCS, and most of the demonstration projects are being made in Canada. Recently, the first power plant with CCS was inaugurated, and also in the US, and much more than so. the EU is late, although they have a significant share of CCS in their long-term roadmap, the 2050 roadmap. It is not followed by enough projects on the ground in Europe. I fully agree with that. And what we've seen, and probably having an ETS high carbon price is not necessarily enough to start the process. You need specific support, as we've seen for renewables, because renewables have not taken off just because of a carbon price or an ETS system. There have been a massive support to encourage wide deployment of renewables, and then you saw the cost of the renewables decline. So we may well see the same phenomenon for CCF if enough R&D and demonstration was there, and if enough price incentives were there. So then the question is how much effort you want to make for CCS.
It's a very fair point, and I'm sorry if we gave that impression. But I think everyone would agree that we should not be waiting, and we need to be getting on with demonstration projects. Are there further questions? Yes.
Yeah, Mark O'Malley, University College Dublin. I've heard the comment made at the panel about how much interconnection there should be, 10%, 15%, etc. I just want to know if the panel, has anyone done the numbers on this? Like, we're almost here like shooting in the dark. And, I bring up somebody mentions heat pumps are a good idea. I'm sure they are. I'm not saying these are bad things. But in my own work, for example, on interconnection, when you go and look for the basic sort of analysis behind these numbers, it's not there. So we seem to be making a lot of decisions on gut instinct, or maybe the information is there. I mean, does the panel believe that we've done all the analysis to back up some of these numbers?
I think the panel was saying that it wasn't a good idea to set a fixed percentage on interconnections, but actually it depended on the local, the mix.
Yeah, but sorry, my point is more general. Is all this stuff we're talking about been underpinned by good analysis, or is a lot of it just knee-jerk, or, that's my basic point. I'm using the interconnection as an example.
Yeah.
No, I mean, first, I was the one that said that I don't like at all that you have a fixed number. It must be much more elaborate. But at the same token also, I think that if we want to have something that looks like a common market, interconnection capacity clearly has to be much, much higher than 10%. That's for sure not enough. But I agree that we need to make more intelligent decisions. Then another thing I would say, if we look at the cost of interconnection in relation to the total cost of the energy system, it's not a cost issue, actually. Even if you build all the interconnections that are ever planned in Europe, that will not, they will have marginal impact on the price of electricity. It will actually, overall, the electricity price will go down. That's what calculations show.
Yes.
So Angela Cart from Rotherstead. I have a specific question for the panel. With respect to the 2030 framework, what's the implication of the EU directive on indirect land use change? Because on sort of fairly simplest reading of that, it also doesn't seem to give very strong incentives for a transition from first to advanced generation biofuels, for example.
Do you want to comment on that? I don't think it doesn't, it's not within this, and I don't think, it's not within our expertise to comment. No. So,
I don't think the package as it was decided was that specific in terms of the new targets for biofuels.
Are there any?
Then maybe some Commission could explain.
Is there anyone here who has a response to that? Any volunteers? Is it in connection with the last question or a different one?
Well, it wasn't really to deliver a response, but I think I would dare to say that the level of detail in the decision from last month doesn't allow any assessment of what impact it will have on indirect land use. I think we have to go much further in the specific implementation before one could say, put that question on the table. Yeah. But I wanted to ask a question because this morning we heard Ian Conn saying that actually one of the good measures EU could take in order to reduce CO2 emissions would be to shift from coal to gas. Now when you say that, you are normally up to an enormous political opposition because of the security of supply argument. Now you didn't say very much about security of supply, but I would like maybe to have a bit more of a comment from the panel on this in view of two observations. The one observation is that, in fact, over the last 10 years, our oil production in the EU has fallen, but our consumption has fallen twice as much. Mm-hmm. That's a message we never hear. And on the natural gas, we have been told about a serious security of supply situation vis-à-vis Russia. Now, a few analyses which have been much more serious than what the newspapers have written have demonstrated that Russia has a much, much more serious security of selling problem vis-à-vis the EU, because it'll be much easier for us to go and find alternative sources than it'll be for Russia to find alternative customers to the gas we're talking about. Would you have any comment on that?
I must say at this point, I think we may get into this issue a little bit later.
Okay.
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 So, and we are running out of time. In fact, we are now over time. So I'm going to leave that to Mark to take his next panel.
Thank you very much. The expertise in this room is extraordinary, as you have discovered in the course of the day. You couldn't all be in all of the sessions all of the time. So we did some thinking about how could we try to make sense of the day, to summarize a little bit. And so the moderators from the breakout sessions met during the lunch with Sir Mark Walport. And what you're about to hear is somewhat of an attempt to pull a few strands together of the day. And that will be followed also then by David Eiton, who will cap that point. So at this point, I believe you're missing a panelist. Okay, good. Sir Mark is the Chief Scientific Advisor to the UK government. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So I think it's extraordinary that in the last 24 hours we've landed the Philae lander on a comet. We've sent something about the size of a domestic fridge on a 10-year, 6.4 billion kilometre journey. We've landed it on a tiny object travelling at an enormous speed through the solar system. We've done that through international collaboration, leadership by the European Space Agency, and I just have not at any moment in this meeting that I've been at detected anything like that joint ambition. So I would give you about 0 out of 10 for ambition. And to extend the sort of metaphor of this poor Philae lander, it may be energy that kills it, because it appears to have landed on its side, and in the darkest of dark shade out on that comet, its batteries may run out quite soon. So the challenge, I think, for us is to sort out the batteries on Earth. So I thought I would retain the summary bit until we've had a bit of discussion, because the exam question we've had is, what are the top priorities for the new Commission? And of course, one of the top priorities is the economy and European growth. But this is the question about the top priorities for the new Commission in relation to energy. And so we've got two panellists. We've got Joan McNaughton sitting on my right, who is the Executive Chair of the World Energy Trilemma for the World Energy Council. Now, of course, one of the challenges is that a dilemma is hard enough, and being stuck on the horns of a dilemma is pretty painful. A trilemma is something else. And that is, of course, one of the challenges. And then we've got Andres Lerschel, who's the chair of microeconomics at the University of Münster and is head of the German government commission to monitor the energy transition. So I'm going to give them 5 minutes each to start. And the exam question for them is, what are the top priorities for the new commission? We might have a little bit of discussion about the panel, but this is your opportunity, as it were, to pretend that you're talking to the Commission, and it is a pretense, because that's not what we are. And tell us what it is you think those top priorities should be. So, Joan, your 5 minutes starts now.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you everybody for staying to the last panel. When you're on the last panel, you're never quite sure how many people you're going to be addressing. And I take issue with Mark on lack of ambition. I don't think everybody would agree that a 40% greenhouse gas emission reduction target is unambitious. And it's one of the most ambitious, if not the most ambitious in the world. Whether we have the collaboration to achieve the other goals of the energy trilemma, the competitiveness and the security, I think is a much more moot point. So maybe I don't completely disagree with him about the need for collaboration, but like Didier, I think it is fantastic that we got the package. I want to make suggest three priorities for the EU. Of course, there are a lot more, but there are just three personally I would highlight. The first has been mentioned during the course of the day about the need to reform the emissions trading scheme. It hasn't worked brilliantly, but it has worked. I remember briefing in the White House, and they just did not believe we were going to have it in 2005, that independent states would collaborate. But it's been undermined by some of its own flaws and by the downturn, and I have to say, by imposing a binding renewables target without thinking of the consequences for the emissions trading scheme. So we have the paradox of emissions going up, huge expenditure on renewables, and we're not getting an efficient approach to taking carbon away. And when we talk in the World Energy Council to business leaders, this lack of coordination among targets is important. And it's really important because of the uncertainty and because of the chilling effect it has on investment. And investment is going to be absolutely crucial. The second point I'd like to highlight is another area of collaboration, and it's around this whole issue of interconnection. We know that interconnection across borders will reduce risk, not just electricity, but I think a lot will depend on how it is effected, how it is implemented. What I'm not a fan of is people in government identifying projects and then expecting the private sector to pay for them and possibly to execute them, but execute them with a very heavy hand from government. That does not work well. So the role of the Commission is crucial here. It's to identify the gaps, to help countries to collaborate, and to build trust so that they are not hesitant about embarking on interconnection. For example, by having procedures for what happens when things go wrong either side of the border. We had a quote from our energy colleagues in the WEC saying there are few examples of good coordination. In fact, for infrastructure companies, cross-border projects are a nightmare. That's what we've got to tackle. The third and final point is that the energy union, apart from interconnection and some of the other good things that are there, I think needs to be handled in a way that observes the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. And I do think that there's a challenge here for the Commission to add value. I really believe in the energy union. I think it could have considerable benefits, but it needs to be done in a way which doesn't add to burdens, which enables countries to carry on with their own energy mix, because I don't see that as incompatible with coordination. In fact, it can contribute to diversity across the union as a whole. And it is encouraging that some of the language about building on national plans found its way into the 2030 package. But one or two other pieces of language in there are perhaps a little bit more concerning, and we must ensure that we don't move into an over-prescription that actually doesn't properly take account of local circumstances and needs. And perhaps we need some mechanisms, rather than prescription from the Commission, some mechanisms like peer review of adequacy of the implications for neighbouring countries and so forth. So all strength to the concept of an energy union, but it's not what you do, it's the way that you do it, as the old song said. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and you've actually kept exactly to 5 minutes, so well done. I agree with you, the target is ambitious, but you have to hit the target. And the question is whether we have the ambition that's going to be necessary to hit the target. That's the key question, and what the accountability is for those now that have set the targets if we don't hit them. Right, Andres, your 5 minutes starts now.
Yeah, that's a good reminder for me, having ambitious targets and not hitting them, since I'm in the monitoring commission of the German government, and we are going to trying to face this problem in 2 weeks' time. But nevertheless, I think it's an excellent opportunity, of course, to build on this agreement of the 2030 package in order to fight the centrifugal forces in the EU Energy Union by implementing these policies jointly. And I think that is really the possibility that is offered here, to think about a joint approach on the big issues. We have already heard about the emission trading system. I think that must be really the key policy initiative. We are now, for example, in many member states talking about moving back to our own policies in the ETS sectors, in the electricity sector. We had a discussion about that in Germany, about phasing out our lignite or soft coal power plants. I think that is the wrong way. It would definitely destroy the instrument that has been a successful story, as well in terms of the setup that it's providing. So here there's a possibility to strengthen this, to include new sectors, to get rid of excess certificates in the long run, and to strengthen it instead of moving back to the national policies. The second thing is the implementation of the renewable target. I think there is again a possibility to implement this jointly, and we have had this discussion with the old 2020 package. I think we should reconsider this experience and think about how we can achieve these targets again jointly, taking into account the different potentials in the different member states, as well the different priorities, and taking into account the interference of the renewables with the ETS and with the electricity markets. So thinking about really market integration, the German experience, I think, is there quite fruitful. Think about how we can integrate, how we can still promote renewables by premier system, not necessarily only by auctioning, as we are thinking about it today. And the third thing is the problem of generation capacity. Again, I think here the implementation of energy security asks for bringing together the potentials of a broader set of member states, like the pentalateral approaches that we are facing in the mid of Europe. But I think here there are many possibilities as well to draw on the European Union as a potential solution for the problems faced by individual member states. And finally, on research and innovation. I think it's as well an excellent opportunity as we are now talking about the revised set plan next year. I think here as well there is a potential. The German government, for example, is now thinking about a set of large research projects that are facilitating the energy transition, that are strategic, long-term, that are systemic and interdisciplinary. And the projects that they have thought about, or that they are currently trying to elaborate, are focusing on new grid structures, on the flexible use of renewables, power to X in many different ways, on material cycles for the energy transition, meaning looking at recycling of mineral resources mainly, and on the future of manufacturing, looking on industrial processes, taking into account the volatility of energy generation. So I think these are four fields where the new Commission should really focus in. And as I said, there are good targets, but now it's in the implementation to help getting really a joint vision for the energy union.
Well done. So you both kept very strictly to time and given us very concrete suggestions. So both of you have hit on the emissions trading scheme, interconnection, energy union, implementation of renewable targets, energy security and innovation. Right. Who wants to come in from the audience? This is your time to tell the Commission what you want them to do. Okay, some American advice on what the Commission should do.
Definitely not advice. A question. In the U.S., the Environmental Protection Agency released a draft rule a few months ago called the Clean Power Plan, which implemented, I'll say, somewhat of a corollary where there's a federal rule that was flexible for states to implement it either individually or collectively in many different ways, whether or not they wanted to do it through a trading system or through individual performance goals themselves, and that they could respond as to whether or not they were going to meet that performance target, which was a CO2 target, on either a mass level or a rate level, i.e. number of tons of CO2 or rate per kilowatt hour, because it was just power sector. Is there any element of that framework that would be useful here?
Jim?
I think it's a great approach, and it's a great approach because it allows for innovation. It allows for responsiveness to local circumstances, and it also allows for comparison of outcomes for best practice. So would it be a good idea to have it here? Yes. Is it on the table at the moment? I don't see it, but others may be more aware than I. But I think this idea of focusing on the outcome and not being prescriptive is absolutely what I would call better regulation, a better approach to regulation.
So that leads me to ask Andreas a question, which is, given that the outcome we want is reduced carbon emission, why would you have a renewable target as opposed to a carbon emission target?
Yeah. Okay, so if you think about the different targets, I think from an economic point of view would like to address market failures and externalities. And I think there are many externalities around in the world, and that's not only the CO2 externality, but there's more. And we know from Tinberg, that you should address one externality with one instrument. And then if you have more, you should probably use more. But then, of course, it's getting complicated, because then we have all the overlaps, all the spillovers, the feedbacks that we have to consider. I'm actually heading an FP7 project that's exactly on this topic. But I think there is a good rationale for having more targets, but more instruments. But I think we should try to minimize the interaction of these different instruments. So therefore, I think if we agree now that there are some externalities coming from the use of renewables, besides the reduction of CO2. Now, then we can as well agree that we want to foster the renewable approach or the increase in the renewable capacity, but we should do that in a way that is not affecting too much our electricity markets, not too much our ETS, and therefore I think the feed-in tariff system is not a good way to take care of these type of externalities. So I think there is more room if you move to the world of the second best, but it has to be done wisely, and we have to come up with a better strategy and better empirics where these externality really are and what the size of these externalities are. So I mean, just a narrative I think is not enough, but we need a little bit more research on trying to capture these different incentives.
Okay, maybe we'll come back to that. So some more suggestions. Right, please.
On your point about the American system for emissions, would it potentially be sensible to add carbon dioxide onto the European list of pollution in excess? Because there's a pollution directive in Europe which avoids citing CO2 as a pollutant in the annex of listed pollutants. If that was added, we could use environmental law and legislation in a very similar way to the United States have done and create a very direct outcome-based approach.
Probably, I probably should not comment on your new question, but probably on the one previously, because that's an issue, of course, that, you know, as well in Germany we are really much worried about, because we have internal targets that are more restrictive than the targets that are put on us from the European legislation. So one of the responses could be to do technology policies and forbid some of these technologies that are very pollutant. And I think with the EU emission trading system, we have already reached another level of implementation, which is at odds with this type of considerations. So if you want to achieve a 40% target and you are under an ETS system, then you don't have a possibility to work with technology fixes, because it's only going to increase the excess allowances that you have in the system, and in the end you have to get rid of them. So if you want to do that and you want to have these individual member state implementations, then you have on top. You have to think about how you get rid of these extra emissions, because otherwise it's not going to pay you anything. And then, I mean, that will be as well one of the advices probably that we are giving to the German government. Think of how you reduce the total gap.
Jane,
come back on that.
I think it's a rather roundabout way to go via the pollution directive, and if I don't see why, if you have the will, to have the approach that you would need to do it that way. But I think on to Andreas's point, fine to have more stringent targets, but it's inherent in the EPA approach, as I understand it, that you will monitor progress towards those targets as well. And that, I think, is what I had in mind when I mentioned peer review, because it's about the quality of the plans and the success of their execution.
I think what I'd say is this session is at least as much a comment session as it is a Q&A session. So, we want to hear what it is you want the Commission to do. And I must say that in my job as Government Chief Scientist in the UK, there's never any shortage of everyone telling me what the British government ought to do. So I'm slightly surprised if there aren't a lot of hands up. So, you were next.
Thank you very much. I want to suggest two things. First, I think the Commission, maybe with some academic help, needs to engage in a series of stress tests around the interactions of all these policy instruments. It's one thing to have belts and suspenders when you're doing a little bit, so you have ETS and you have the renewable efforts and so on. It's a totally different thing when you get to the outer edge of what the system can actually do. And then if you add on top of it something new from the combustion plant directive and on and on and on, and then you discover you've got excess credits, and then somebody removes some credits, and next thing you know, you have this Rube Goldberg machine. Nobody knows how it works. And the interactions between the policy instruments become overwhelming to the point where they generate massive welfare losses, or deadweight losses on the economy. These are hard to model, but they ought to, with competing models, do a series of stress tests on these interactions, because my instinct is that they're going to get to the limits of this system. And the second, very quickly, is to pick up on the lack of ambition comment, which may or may not be fair. I think it would be helpful if the Commission would lay out a vision for what international collaboration looked like, with a set of priorities and a game plan for how to do it. Whether it's more stuff joint with ARPA-E and with the Chinese and so on, but just some vision for how to do that. Because whenever we start talking about international collaboration, then somebody talks about ITER, and then the kind of conversation ends. And I mean, ITER's kind of a disaster, but that aside, when you've got a facility, you've got to cooperate. But this is not a facility. This is ideas, and so the cooperation's harder to organize and yet more essential. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Some more suggestions.
I want to start with your lack of ambitions comment as well. My question is, or comment, whatever you like, should it be, talking about energy innovation, should it be a top priority for the Commission to establish an arm's length, very focused agency with a sufficient distance from the day-to-day Commission bureaucracy or national member states that focuses on high-risk, high-potential energy R&I?
Okay, so European ARPA-E. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I would like the Commission to have a plan towards the target on a least cost basis. And for that, I don't agree there should be a specific target for renewables, which I think is a proxy for limiting imports. I think we need to be grown up about import. You may have a strategy to achieve self-sufficiency. I'm not sure you're going to have any energy-intensive industry left when you achieve that. The reality is that continental European companies are contractually committed to buy gas from Russia up to and beyond 2030. If the EU wants to buy out those contracts at the cost of several hundred billion euros, then fine. But, you know, this is the reality. We should deal with it. Most failures of gas delivery in Europe have been down to technical intermittent failures on infrastructure, not geopolitics.
Okay, there's right at the back.
My wish would be a little bit to the Commission to be more clear on what they want to achieve. And I think what we are seeing in practice is that we are mixing up instruments and targets. So if our main goal in Europe is to reduce the CO2 emissions, then the only single target should be the CO2 emission reduction. Everything else, like a renewable targets and energy efficiency target, doesn't bring anything to the emission reduction. It just moves emission from one sector to the other. So we should be clear. That doesn't mean that it might be other reasons why we might energy efficiency or we might need support for renewables, but we should also keep in mind what we want to achieve. So we want to achieve that we have a competitive economy? Do we want to bring technologies to states that they have reached a level of technical maturity that they can deploy at a large scale, and so on? And just to comment to the US, what was mentioned with the EPS, we should keep in mind, well, even if everybody cited it, that EPS deliver emission reduction, it doesn't. US states like California, which have introduced an EPS since a very long time, have not seen any CCS power plant development, which would be the logical case. And it's quite similar for the new plants. If you introduce the EPS, what is the impact assessment report of the US EPA says on it? It just says it will not have any impact on cost. So that looks surprising. But if you read further, it states, well, within the next 15 years, nobody will invest anyway in a power plant, so it doesn't matter at all. So we should be careful. It might be the right thing to do on a long-term perspective to say, we do not want coal, but then we should be clear in saying it and not hiding it by something like an emission performance standard.
Okay, I'll give the panel a go whilst you think up some more things you want to tell the Commission.
Okay, thanks for these comments. When we wrote the first report to the German government, we actually made exactly the same points, because in Germany we have set up a transformation path over the next 50 years, and we came up with a list of targets that we want to achieve, not only on renewables, efficiencies in different sectors with different technologies, and our comment was you have to build up a hierarchy of your targets, because if you have all these different targets on the table, of course, first, I mean, you never know which targets are really the ones that you want to achieve and which are just the, as you said, milestones that are describing a path towards some place in the future. And if you find out that some of these things are probably too costly to achieve, they are probably environmentally not as good as you thought, or they are socially not acceptable, then you have to have a possibility to readjust this long-term pathway. And we, in the Commission, we said, well, you should focus on CO2 emissions reduction and on phase-out of nuclear. So these are the two overarching targets of the energy transformation in Europe, and then you have these different possibilities. You can move on efficiencies, or you can move on renewables, and if you find out that some of these things doesn't turn out as well, so then you shift to other technologies, or you readjust. So I think that is something I'm very happy with. But as I said, if you want to stick to more targets, you have to come up as well with a little bit better description on how to implement them or how to adjust them in the light of some of these other externalities. So that is the point. And just one other comments to these impact assessments or these stress tests. I mean, I've been working on the impact assessment of the 2030 framework with CGE models, trying to assess this trade-off of costs and sectoral impacts and environmental achievements. I think you are perfectly right to ask for this type of stress tests, because I think this is done very often quite in a limited way. So we just define one or two dimensions and then we iterate on that. But of course, there's a whole universe that we want to explore. And so therefore, I think that is really important to do much better than we have done it in the past. In Germany, we asked the government to assess the 70 policies that they implemented after phasing out nuclear policy. 70 policies new. What they give us is one-liners describing the policies, okay? So I think that's not sufficient, and you cannot be happy, with this type of assessment of the policies that you are implementing. So you have to do really a much better job in evaluating what you have done.
Jane.
Just on the adjustment of policy and so forth, I think actually one of the best examples I've seen is one country where they had a very regular work with industry and financial community and government at various levels to assess their roadmap and to adjust it as need be in the light of changes in circumstance or experience of implementation. So I think that kind of dialogue could be a useful addition to the process. I think the idea of stress tests is fantastic. I think the ARPA-E proposal is absolutely fantastic, and the idea of an international collaborative vision. Final point is around this issue of the relationship between the CO2 emissions reduction target stroke mechanism in the ETS and what else you are trying to deliver. I absolutely agree that we shouldn't be having a proliferation of targets, but there's no doubt that you need some very specific mechanisms to support technologies, including the really big ones, to get from where they are now to implementation. The CCS, I think, is just absolutely classic because it's a public good to have CCS. That is shown to be operating at scale. I'm not saying shown to work, because it does work, but you've got to have the business models and so forth. But it's not in any individual company's balance sheet even, or interest to do that. And so we've just got to grasp that nettle, and there's nothing in the way of the Howard, others know, as Charles, there's nothing technically to stop that, and nothing could do more to help with our 80% reduction target.
So you both said that you would reform the ETS. How would you do it?
Well, I think the first one, I mean, we have to think about broadening the system, because if we are now starting to tackle all these different problems in reaching our targets, then it's better to have one instrument than this whole suite of instruments that is addressing all these different other sectors. I think a kickstart could be to think about transportation, and trying to get this in, and that would probably revitalize a bit the ETS. I think it's not. It's probably as well as something we have to think about, really getting rid of these excess certificates that are in the system, because they are not going to be dissolved over time, at least not with the proposal that we have on the table, and we should try to avoid pushing too much the market-based system, but at one point in time it might be necessary, to get a fresh start and to set this up.
Okay, I really want to bring in people very briefly.
I mean, in retiring these certificates, we need to just get ourselves to when the greater ambition kicks in, which will begin to help. But it's not incompatible with this being a market designed instrument, because basically when it was designed, we didn't foresee some very, very big change in the context, namely the financial downturn and its severity, which really impacted on the number of allowances that had been given. So it doesn't destroy its integrity as a market-based system to retire allowances.
Okay, I want to bring in people who haven't been in this session, so don't you? Okay.
Rob Sokolow, Princeton. I guess the Waxman-Markey bill, which was a cap-and-trade bill, followed the financial crisis by months instead of preceding it as the EU version did. And by that time, the concept of a collar, which is a word I haven't heard here, was developed, which meant that there would be both a maximum price and a minimum price. There would be some wise group of people who were going to be steering the market through a sweet spot that evolved in time, where there was both a capacity, a quantity constraint and a price constraint, developing a band. And that's, as soon as you say that and realize that takes some of the best of the tax and of the cap and trade, you're sort of done. And then you don't have this, how are we going to justify retiring the permits? You retire them because you've got a better idea now and you can use it from here on. Am I missing something?
The government buys them. The governments buy them and hold them, and so they take them out of the market.
Yeah, I understand.
It's a kind of reverse of quantitative easing.
Yes. I understand, but there's almost a sense of guilty feeling in the room. We're going to do that, even though we mustn't. We're going to violate something if we do it. You're doing it because you have a better idea, which took a little while to develop, which was called a collar, which has some of each, and then you're starting on with your better plan today.
I agree, but even if you started a collar today, you'd still have the overhang of allowances, and that's still an issue.
If you start it today, then the collar goes away. You just do it.
Right, enough on that topic. We've got some suggestions. Right. Please, you wanted to come in.
Jørgen Henningsen, well, I have actually argued for a long period that there should be a withdrawal or a minimum price for the allowances, so I can only wholeheartedly support that. But I want to make one comment on this idea of just having one instrument, the ETS, because if we are to achieve a 40% reduction in 2030 only based on the ETS, I would abstain from predicting a price. But I would say it would be very unlikely that price would be less than $50 a ton. And that would have two implications. That would have drastic implications on the energy-intensive industries, which many member states and industries would oppose. It would also have drastic implications for the utilities, because they would make huge windfall profits, because all the hydropower and all the nuclear power sold today would then be sold at prices that would reflect this price, simply because the liberalization of the energy markets imply that electricity is now sold at the highest price, which is for the most expensive production necessary to meet the demand. And I'm not so sure that everybody would be ready to accept these implications.
Okay, more interventions. Okay, what's the Commission do?
Okay, so a voice from the equipment manufacturers side. A wish may be tied to a warning. And the wish is if the Commission and whoever identifies gaps in products or technologies that are needed to go down the pathway that has been foreseen, it is important that attractive business opportunities are created around them so that companies are, I would say, motivated to invest and develop those products. And the motivation has to have a long enough time scale, not just a once-off. In my view, there is way too much focus on either R&D grants or demo programs, which, if you don't see the business opportunity down the road, are not really attractive. Still, companies engage in it, which is good, but I guess probably not at full steam. The warning is that companies are operating, those companies that do these kind of things, operating on a global scale, they will invest wherever in this world is the best business opportunity. So it doesn't just have to be marginally profitable. It has to be attractive compared to all the other things you can do around the world. Otherwise, the things will just never appear.
Okay. Policy stability. Who else wants to come in? All right, I'll let people back in then. Oh, there's no one at the back there before you come back in. You can go back in a second.
Yes, good evening. Kasper Kivisaar, former Estonian diplomat. I didn't quite get the point about gas and geopolitics. If I heard something positive, then I'm really surprised. And I sincerely hope that people may reconsider. And I have a suggestion what not to do in the framework of this new framework. We should not build any more pipelines to Russia or from Russia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Right. Okay, I'll let a few people back in who've had goes before. So then you.
Okay, very quickly. So, couple of pieces. One, I would suggest take a deep look and learn from the past. So, for example, all of the discussion today about the cost of renewables is based upon old history and old policy approaches. And we know today that renewables, particularly solar, are cost effective in most places, particularly where gas is expensive today. So that's one piece. I would say that there's a very strong lesson that feed-in tariffs as a quantitative price policy may not be the best one, or design them with collars or do other things like that. There could be some significant value in a European-wide electricity market, and there would be significant value in moving that market into what's called flexibility products. Not just capacity markets, but flexibility products. We've done a lot of work on this, the Australians, many others have, lots of examples there. And then lastly, to reflect our recommendations from the National Academy that we made in terms of climate mitigation is to go forward with adaptive policies that have a regular check and verification in them, and anticipate that there will be technology innovation coming forward so that the policy framework can adapt and enable that technology innovation.
Okay, thank you. I think the last point from the floor, then I'm going to give each of the panelists a minute, and then I'll try and sum up the whole meeting.
Stuart Hazeldine from Edinburgh University. I'm interested in positive incentives to enable people to build CCS if they want to, because dozens of companies have tried and lost money, big time. So we're going to have CO2 arising in states like Germany or Netherlands, and maybe even Poland, but that has to get to a storage destination such as the North Sea or the Baltic. So connecting Europe should not just speak about gas pipes and electricity, but should also speak about carbon dioxide pipes and carbon dioxide shipping to enable those CCS projects to capture, but then to store as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so last reflections from the panel. Jane.
I think the idea of regular review is absolutely right. I'd reiterate what I said, which is to do it in a permeable way with the key stakeholders, not least because one of the messages we got in the World Energy Council work that I lead is that policymakers want input from business because of the greater expertise and the fast-changing nature of the technology landscape. I agree that we need to think about a vision here and a vision for infrastructure generally, but I come back to my point that that should be a vision which is a vision in all humility, not prescribed by the bureaucrats or implemented by the bureaucrats. would be a great idea to move to an EU-wide electricity market, and certainly the idea of flexible products ought to happen anyway in whichever market you're in. I think probably the way to do that is through building out the regional markets that exist, Nord Pool and so forth, and then thinking about how you link them. And that comes back to this point about independence of energy mix, but greater alignment on market structure and market framework.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, last thought.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very much in favor of your collar idea, of course, no? But of course the collar must be as well giving a frame, no, for the prices, and that is related to the ambition, no? And so I think the minimum prices I've heard about, they are probably outside, no, what we would see, no, from a market result, and that would of course generate a lot of problems, no, in the medium run if we don't really go into these trajectory. And so therefore I think it's a good idea, no, but it has to be designed realistically in order to do what it should do, prevent some unforeseeable turmoils, and therefore provide some basis for long-term planning. I found your comment interesting about the costs with and without the renewables concerning the ETS target only, because I think that is as well showing that we are not only talking about efficiency here, because if you buy for a moment that we only care about CO2, then it would be the ETS, and from an efficiency point of view would be done. But obviously it's as well about distributional issues here, because in the German case, for example, we've seen that of course the promotion of renewables put away a lot of pressure as well from industry, no? Because it reduced the ETS prices, it reduced the electricity prices in Germany significantly. So therefore I think we are here as well talking about a trade-off between efficiency on the one hand and equity issues on the other hand, and I think that will be probably as well a trade-off we will face much more in the future as electricity prices are increasing, and we are more and more worried now about what these energy policy actually imply, not only for our industry, not only for our electricity intensive trade exposed industry, but as well for the households that are affected.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So let me just try and briefly draw the threads together. So I agree, we have ambitious targets. Our 2050 target is the one that is really ultimately very important. The question is whether our ambition for delivery has the parity with the targets that we've set ourselves. Now, I've had reports of the 6 parallel sessions, and let me draw some threads that I think were interesting from them. So I'm going to start with the resource efficiency, because we always tend to focus an awful lot on the production side without actually focusing sufficiently probably on the demand side. And I'm going to pick up the social science first, because we tend again to focus on the technology, but we have to actually focus on the users and understanding what the incentives are for all of us to actually reduce our energy consumption. And we actually have to understand that there's a generational issue here as well. And we're not the youngest generation that's represented in this room, I have to say, speaking personally. So understanding behavior. Now, incentives matter, and therefore we have to provide consumers with the rewards that they value to provide the incentives for them to be able to reduce their consumption. And that's extremely important. And at the same time, we've got to provide a set of appropriate incentives to producers, because of course the incentive to a producer is to sell more of your product in general terms. And so there is in a sense a conflict for the producers between reducing demand on the one hand and maximizing profit on the other. And that's going to require some fairly nifty economics. People have talked about other things. They've talked about things like the circular economy. There's no doubt with the Internet of Things we're going into a very different world, but the Internet of Things itself is going to consume quite a lot of energy. Even if the individual components are micro, the fact that there are billions of them turns micro into macro. So the other 5 sessions were on biofuels, bioenergy, solar, wind and grid, CCS, low carbon cars and unconventional gas. And I can't help observing that their nuclear appeared to be missing. And I'll say something about that at some point as well. So on biofuels and bioenergy, move to second generation crops, better use of residue, use land more effectively. I mean, these are the main messages that I think came from that session. Then on contentious but difficult to implement. On solar, wind and grid, much of the discussion seemed to be more about actually how we think about the system as a whole. It goes to some of the very difficult modelling questions, which is modelling these extraordinarily complicated systems. And the point was made that we have to think about heat, transport and electricity together, because of course we depend on all of those. On CCS, we've had the discussion just now. If there isn't a market for the carbon, then it's quite difficult to see what the economics of it are. And you can commoditize the carbon dioxide, and that has been done, or you can basically charge for the externalities of burning fossil fuel, which is generating the carbon dioxide in the first place. On low carbon cars, well, it was an interesting title because actually cars aren't necessarily the most efficient way of mass transit, and actually if we want to reduce energy use, then a car is not the optimal way to do this. A bicycle is good, but does want people one or two at a time, but that's actually about trains, it's about mass transport systems. And the challenge of cars, of course, is that they are as good as the cleanliness, as it were, of the electricity that drives them. So if they're actually fueled and charged by coal-fired power plants, then you've actually got coal-fired cars, even if they run off batteries. And that's one of the interim challenges. On unconventional gas, there's the question of social acceptability, what's in the water that's put down, and the challenges of different densities of population in Europe compared with some of the other parts of the world where hydraulic fracturing is used. But that brings me to an area that I don't think has been explored very much, which is that it's the area of where science meets values. And I think that we often have a discussion with the community as though this is actually the scientists telling the people, as it were, what they need to know about energy. And if we're going to have the best discussion, we need to have a two-way discussion, which actually recognises that this is as much about values of populations as it is about the science itself. And therein, I think, lies some of the rub. And I think that we have to recognise that in Europe, indeed around the world, different countries, different nations, in some parts, different regions, have different values. And so we have a Europe where some countries accept nuclear energy, other countries don't accept nuclear energy. We have a situation where if you take fracking, the engineering discussion is about seismicity, it's about contamination of the water table, and it's about fugitive methane release. The discussion on the other side actually isn't about that. It's about some people not liking fossil fuels at all, other people simply not liking big companies, and then there's a further group who don't want the disruption associated with large industrial plant in their vicinity. And those are all entirely legitimate concerns, but I don't think we have the best discussion if we don't recognise that this is a conversation at least as much about values as it is about the science and the technology. And I think that one of the challenges for Europe is actually recognising that amongst our different countries, we do have different values about things. And I have to think a lot about innovation, and almost any area you look at, stem cell science would be an area where different countries take different views. And so the challenge is, in a single energy market, however that's defined, does that mean a single energy mix? And I think that's come up a bit. So I think that as part of the discussion, we've got to think a lot about the values as well. And that's actually ultimately why we have democracies, because it is our democracies, it's the politicians, it's the people we elect that will ultimately make the policy decisions. So to come back to the end, I mean, I think the word vision has come up several times. And there is, I think, a vision of what we want to achieve in terms of carbon targets. But I don't think there is yet an absolutely clear vision as to how we're going to get there. A lot of the discussion was about the economic instruments. I was surprised in some ways more of the discussion wasn't about the technological grand challenges, which is where I tried to kick you off in the first place, which is that the technological challenge of getting a fridge onto a comet, not quite a fridge, but anyway, getting something to a fridge at the comet, was an extraordinary technological grand challenge which nations collaborated I went to medical school originally. My world is medicine. I actually have no axe to grind in this area. But I'm struck that in the world of medicine, when it came to the grand challenge, which was the Genome Project, nations collaborated. So nations have collaborated over genomes, they've collaborated over space. There are all sorts of areas where they've collaborated. Have nations collaborated sufficiently over the energy technological challenges? I don't think so, actually, and that's where I think there is a failure of ambition. At least my job is to be slightly provocative. So form should always follow function. That was the thing I always learned. It's the thing that you teach medical students actually. And so the function we want to achieve is that we want to decarbonize, we want to stop emitting carbon dioxide and indeed other pollutants into the atmosphere and into the oceans. And so that should be the target. And I think the point was brought up smartly about the difficulty of mixing instruments and targets. We've just got to make sure that the incentives are in the right place. We've heard some very good suggestions as to what we might tell the Commission. The stress tests, the issue of policy stability, the issue of learning from history, the importance of reforming the ETS scheme, the idea of ARPA-E. So I think there have been some jolly good ideas. It's not going to be me that feeds them into the Commission, but plenty of you have got opportunities to do that, and I hope you'll do so. But I hope you've had an enjoyable session. I've certainly enjoyed the sessions I've been to this afternoon. I hope that was a fair summary. If it isn't, at least it will have provoked some of you. So thank you to the panel, and thank you to all of you for coming.
Thank you very much, Mark. We will be shortly going up. I hope you can join us for a drink upstairs in a few moments. Before we do that, I just wanted to say one thing first. This is, for Science Business, a 10th anniversary. 10 years ago, a group of journalists started this company with the idea that we would try to do something about the problems of communication among the worlds of academic research, industry, and policy. And so that's what we've been doing, and that's where the name comes from ultimately. An important motivation for that, though, is today we've been talking, we're in Brussels, so it's a heavy policy discussion. Today we've been talking a lot about how government should regulate and how government should spend its money. I never forget, because of my background with the Wall Street Journal before, that in the OECD, most funding is actually in R&D is actually from the private sector. So it's an important decision how the companies end up spending their money on R&D. So the decision that someone like David Eiton makes from BP, that Carlos Hertel from GE, that Charles Sotil from Alstom, Klaus Vogelwang, is he still here? From Novozymes. This is extremely important in the end on how this all turns out for all of us. So with that momentous build-up, David, I wanted to let you make a closing remark. So over to you.
It falls to me to conclude a long day, and I do not intend to try and summarize anything. I think Mark's done a fantastic job, but I hope you'll agree it's been a productive day. But it's also been my pleasure to sponsor the series of 8 roundtables that led to this summit. And that's because BP cares about the energy system in Europe. We're a major player in it. I've learned a lot from the sessions we've had here, not least of which is you don't scratch your nose at an auction or in an event like this because you may have to speak. Nonetheless, in the context of the so-called energy trilemma, I think there are some unique things about Europe. It is a major energy importer and is likely to be for quite some time. It really is right out there in terms of its ambitions in the context of climate, and the 2030 framework is a good start. It's not homogeneous. The states, nations in Europe are all quite different, and no source of energy, certainly, is without its risk. And all of them have their protractors and detractors. So this is always going to be a charged debate. But Europe does have this big advantage of being better at turning the use of a joule of energy into a euro. And we shouldn't forget that. I'm not going, as I say, not going to summarise, but I would make some observations about the role of technology, and I say this particularly because I can see a lot of parallels with my own role in BP, and that is that the current system we have here is a function of the resources we have and the technologies have. And I think technologies do have a great role to play in informing the debate about the future. They may even potentially have some insights to the future, but they particularly have some sense of the fundamentals that are driving that future. The first thing is that certain areas of scientific research and endeavour have got extraordinary potential. You know, there's an exponential nature to some of these things. Biotechnology is one, and I think some of the advanced materials work's going on has got quite extraordinary potential, and we need to nurture that and look after it. But in fact, the big changes we've seen in the energy systems over the last 10 years or so have been a function of the distinction between modular technologies and big-scale technologies. And we've seen extraordinary reductions in through learning curves, through manufacturing basically, whether it was in China or elsewhere, of the cost of modules. And I think when you accumulate or integrate these changes over time, they make a big difference. And they're probably as important as some of the more transformational type things that could come out of the world science system. The other one that I think one has to remark is about the nature of digital technologies and the ability of them to scale at very little cost and light speed. And this particularly informs people, but this is a context within which the energy systems operate, which has another incredibly disruptive potential, and others here have described how that might be. Another fundamental actually is the difference between cities, which are concentrated, and they need concentrated energy, I'm sorry, and then dispersed populations who probably do have access to enough distributed forms of energy to do what they want to do, and actually using those things locally and not trying to ship them off to the cities is probably a very good idea. And so we need to be careful not to force the system to do things that are actually inefficient or unnatural. And the last comment I'd make about fundamentals is that the nature of markets is driven by often the physical character of different forms of energy. You can transport oil around the world at a very low cost relative to its value. And hence the markets are by and large global. It's less so for gas, they're more regional, and actually electricity is priced by the second, by the place in the street almost. And we have to be very careful not to sort of try and act inconsistent with some of these very natural fundamentals. And I think technologists like me and many others in the room here can assist policymakers by making sure that they understand how some of these fundamentals are at play, and how if you ignore them, you'll generate a policy system that can have unintended consequences around the world. The third point I'd make is that we I think all watch with interest how the energy union, I think some people call it a philosophy, plays out. It feels like a very courageous ambition, but clearly also has great potential. And we as businesses will seek to respond to what we perceive to be clear and reliable business signals and deliver the energy that Europe wants as responsibly as we possibly can. And the only other comment I'd make about Europe is that it does not exist in isolation. And we've heard lots of dimensions of this. But in the context of an effective price on carbon, Europe does need to worry about what the effective price of carbon is in places with whom it trades and how it deals with that discontinuity in the way that it sets up itself in the world. So in conclusion, I would like to say that BP's objective in this summit was to bring together leading academics, industrialists and policymakers to have an informed discussion on the future of energy in Europe at an important time for this Commission, and also at an important time in the route march to, in particular, Paris next December. I have no doubt whatsoever that technology can play its part in accelerating the future that we all want. I like to think that there have been some good ideas surfaced here today, which can contribute to the thinking of the policymakers, particularly here in Europe, but also those who are visiting us from elsewhere in the world, and they can either contribute or take things away from that. So it falls to me to thank, on behalf of BP, the sponsor for this event, our speakers, our moderators, delegates for your participation and for your interest, insight and engagement. I'd also like to thank very much Rich and his team in Science Business, with whom we've had a long collaboration for their excellent facilitation of this event and those we've had with you over the past 3 years. We are genuinely grateful for the opportunity to support this debate and allow experts to share their perspectives on it. We greatly appreciate your engagement. We have learnt a lot from it. It will help my company, but I hope it will help many companies. I'd like to thank you very much indeed for joining us all to here today. Thank you.